pretty loud. My breathing is pretty loud, so if you could turn it down just a little bit. Thank you. I wanted to kind of begin this morning by just a reflection, maybe just a reflection about ourselves, because something I've been thinking about a lot about this week is this question about really what makes us uncomfortable when we see it. And specifically, what I'm wondering is, are there times when someone's desperation or their neediness or total dependence make us uncomfortable? Now, the reason I ask this question is because I think there is a kind of dependence that does make us uncomfortable at times. Now, just to kind of preface this, there certainly is a kind of dependence that we're okay with. So for instance, if you see a mother with her child, generally speaking, I think we're going to be okay with this kind of dependence. This kind of neediness is normal, even if the kid is kicking and screaming, even if the kid's entire life revolves around mom. Very normal for us to accept this kind of dependence, this desperation, this kind of neediness. But I suspect that for all of us, we've all seen a kind of desperation, a kind of neediness, kind of total dependence on somebody that makes us uncomfortable. For instance, I'm sure that all of us, maybe we've seen it, maybe we know people who are like this, but have you ever seen a boyfriend beg his girlfriend not to break up with him in public? It's a pretty sad and it's a pretty uneasy scene, right? Where you see this gentleman, he's groveling towards his girlfriend, or maybe soon-to-be ex-girlfriend. He's begging her, crying out, please don't leave me, please don't leave me. You're my life, you're all that I want. If you leave, I'll never find true love again. I'm nothing without you. And you kind of watch this and you're like, man, this is so uncomfortable. It's really hard to watch. It makes me uneasy. I think there's a term that we use today, we call this an ick, right? So this gives us this feeling of an ick for all of us, that sometimes we feel this is something that's off-putting. But maybe a question that is good to wrestle with here is, why do we find this, if you want to maybe use an older word, icky, or why do we find this kind of behavior off-putting? Why is it sometimes we feel so uncomfortable when somebody shows this kind of desperate need for somebody else? Now, I think sometimes the reason why we don't like it is because it's manipulative, right? I think I share this every week. I have a 4-year-old daughter, so I've learned a lot about kids manipulating you to try to do what they want you to do, right? They use their powers of charisma and their tears and their holding and their crying and their losing it and their tantrums, all to kind of get what they want. And unfortunately, sometimes it's not just relegated to children. Sometimes it's relegated to adults as well. They too sometimes manipulate people, and that makes some of us upset. But there are other times, I think, that we are often just annoyed when we see this kind of desperation. We feel ashamed for the person that we're seeing it from, because I think, and this is maybe just me, it offends our sense of worthiness and self-reliance. Now, I bet many of you here consider yourselves grown up, and as you're growing up, you probably worked really hard to get the respect of the people around you, maybe getting your parents to believe or to trust you in the things that you do. And so something that we are all trying to aim to grow in is trying to be worthy or trying to be self-reliant and to demonstrate that to other people. And we really hate it when people don't see us as someone who is trustworthy, that someone doesn't see us as worthy, that someone doesn't see us as self-reliant. I think what we're really worried about is how people might see us if we were to be that desperate or to be that needy. Now, I think that all of us feel this way because whenever you see scenes like the one that I pictured to you about this desperate person looking at this other person, we may not say this to the person, but we might be thinking, don't you have any self-respect? Don't you have any pride in yourself that you would just throw yourself at somebody else like that? And so I think sometimes we just dislike seeing this kind of desperation and dependence in people. But God is not like that. God is not like us that he is disappointed or he's ashamed or that he's annoyed by our dependence on him. In fact, he welcomes our dependence upon him. He loves it when we put all of our confidence in him, even if it looks foolish to the world around us, because the foolishness of God is wiser than the world. And that's what I really hope you see today as we talk about this passage. And as we kind of look at this text about the idea of dependence in God and what pleases God, that a faith that is totally dependent on Jesus is actually pleasing to God. Now, you might think this is super easy, right? Because these are just easy words. We all have heard this many, many times. I'm sure your parents have talked to you about what faith looks like. But I want to encourage you that this picture, though easy to say, is hard to live. And I think as we pay careful attention to the main characters in today's lesson and narrative, it will show that total dependence on Jesus is not easy, because we need to ask ourselves, is this what our faith actually looks like? Now, going into the story today, as you kind of read the first few verses, the image that you get is that you really see that anybody coming from this region seems to be unlikely to be a believer upon Christ or to have any hope in Jesus Christ. Because it starts in this region called Tyre or Tyre, where it's located northwest of Galilee, and so a lot of Jesus' ministries happened in Galilee. They've moved northwest into this region called Tyre or Tyre, and this region is now known as current-day Lebanon. In Jesus' day, it was known as Phoenicia, and before that, it was known as the Canaanite Empire. And the mention of this place to a Jewish person at the time would make a Jewish person wrinkle their nose or give you a disdainful look because of how they thought about this region. Tyre and Sidon had a long history with Israel, one that was not great, because Canaan had at one time been Israel's longest enemy, one of its worst enemies throughout the scriptures. And in the recent history of this happening, within the Maccabean era, which is about 200 BCE, we can see that Tyre actually fights a war against Israel. And because of all these different things and all these different political relationships that Tyre and Israel has had, it makes Jewish people like Josephus, the famous Jewish Roman historian, say that Tyre was our bitter enemy. And it's not just the military that really made Israelites kind of be off-putting towards Tyre. It was also because Tyre was the center of pagan activity. Now, paganism describes kind of these religious practices that are outside of God's people. And if it was a business, Tyre would be booming in this business of pagan activity. They loved paganism. In fact, so much so that a Jewish person at the time would think that Tyre symbolized paganism itself. Now, that's just the region. We now look at this woman who is a Gentile at the beginning of the story. She is from this region, which again historically means that her people did not get along with the Israelites, that the Gentiles had a fairly poor interaction with the Jews because they were called unclean. And if Jewish people would not associate with Gentiles because of their uncleanliness, and especially with people from this region, because they were especially unclean and especially hostile to Israel. And if you really want to know how Israel felt about them, you just kind of listen to the words that Israel would speak about people from Tyre. And again, if someone called you this, you probably would have to fight them, right? So number one, you'd call them pagans, maybe not that bad, unclean, godless, and this is the one that probably someone might fight you about if you called them dogs. Now, after this has been told, we're kind of left to wonder two questions, I think. The first question is, why would Jesus answer the request of this woman because she is such an enemy? And the second question is, why would this woman look to Jesus to heal her daughter? I think the answer to both questions is because her hope in Jesus is real. In Matthew 15, this is a parallel account to Mark's account. It gives the account of the Syrophoenician woman, which in Matthew's account he calls the Canaanite woman. And in that story, we actually get more details about this woman and the way she trusted Jesus to heal her daughter. She says specifically to Jesus in Matthew 15, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." Now, from Mark's telling of the story, he's telling us something about the kind of person she was in terms of how she interacted with Jesus. That her question wasn't just a one-off question, but in fact, she was persistently and consistently asking Jesus to come help and heal her daughter. Now, so much so that maybe just like us, the disciples said to her, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." They didn't like her persistence. They didn't like her desperation. It was just even too much for them. But this woman seemed to have a grip on what was happening. She had a grip about who Jesus actually was. Because look at the title that she uses in Matthew. She calls him Lord, the Son of David. Now, this title, Son of David, means more than just someone who comes from the lineage of David, an important king in Israel. It's actually a messianic title used for someone who's fulfilling the promise made to King David, that there will be someone in his lineage that will reign over the people of God. And that's the title she uses for Jesus here. So she has this deep understanding of who this Jesus is. She is resigned to the fact that only Jesus is the one who could heal her daughter, and she knows his identity. So she's willing to pursue Jesus because he knows what he can do. She does all of this at the cost of her own pride, at the cost of being uncomfortable, about being persistent and asking Jesus, even if people think that she's annoying. And she's willing to give up all sense of worth because her hope and dependence are upon Jesus. This is a picture here about what dependence upon God looks like in this situation. And I want to ask you, has there ever been a time in your own life where you were this desperate, that you were this dependent on God? All of us here have had times in our lives where we've had desperation happen in our lives. In fact, even today, there are a number of different circumstances and events and things that are happening in our church right now that you might feel are out of your control. People who are struggling with their health, both physical and mental. People who are maligned, their families are broken. Maybe you even might be also having a sick child, much like this Canaanite woman. And you know the problem is that once they deal with these issues, they're going to have lasting impacts upon their life, and you might feel powerless in how you deal with it. How do you guys deal with all of this fear, all this pent-up anxiety, all of this worry, all these doubts? Where do you turn to as all of these things build up and kind of well inside you, and they need an outlet for it to be resolved? Where do you go? It should be to Jesus, I think. And I think we should come to him desperately, needing him for everything that we have. I think that desperation is actually a really interesting trait, because desperation actually reveals something in our lives. And that's really, what do we actually trust in? What are the things that really matter to us? What are the things that we turn to when things go out of control? When basically the plane has been shot down and everything has gone black and everything is about to end? What is the thing that you look to in your life that you turn to for hope and help in these times? What do you rely on to fix these problems? Has your desperation, has your neediness actually turned you to Jesus, your Savior? You know, as Christians, our life fundamentally is a life of dependence upon God. We don't just depend on God for salvation. I think sometimes when you hear Christians talk about being a Christian, it's just about Jesus and being saved by sin, or saved from our sin. But actually, when you think about what it means to be Christian, it means that we depend on Christ or depend on God for our entire lives, and that we trust him with all the things that are happening, that because we think that he's in complete control, that we can rely on him in every decision and in every circumstance. And when difficult times come, and they will come for you and me, the true character of our faith, our need for God, should be the most clearly demonstrated thing that we should see. But for all of us here who have had these moments of desperation, had these moments of neediness, what did it demonstrate in your own life? What did it say about you? What did it say about me? My other question is, would you come to Christ like this woman came, sacrificing her pride and image? Is that the way you come before God in your request and your desperation? Would you be willing to beg as this woman begged? Would you be able to persist as this woman persisted? Would you be willing to humble yourself as this woman humbled herself? Do you trust Jesus the same way she trusts Jesus? Now, ask this question because this is the kind of faith that pleases God. When the darkness comes around you and you feel the most hopeless in your situation, you turn to Christ who gives you light in the darkness because he is all of your hope and he is the thing that you turn to in the time of your need. I hope that this is a explanation or discussion or maybe like an image of what your faith looks like, because that's what it should look like for those who are God's people. Now this woman further demonstrates her faith in verses 27 through 30, where she has this kind of really deep exchange with Jesus, and so that's what we're going to move on to now. So after seeing the woman, and the woman persisting in her hope to have her daughter be healed from this unclean spirit, Jesus shares with her the primary mission of which he has come. He says, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." Jesus' primary mission throughout the New Testament is firstly to go to the Jews and bring this bread. Throughout the Old Testament, Israel has been called God's children, and for Jesus, going to the Jewish people is first a matter of priority, because he sees it as his direct responsibility to serve the natural children first before they go elsewhere. And what Jesus is going out to do is he's going out to there, as he said, is to feed them bread. Now, we've maybe talked a lot about this topic already, where we see these miracles of bread, and I'm sure that throughout the region, people are probably hearing that Jesus was actually doing these wonderful miracles between different towns, and he was actually giving bread to people. And so I think the first thing that comes to mind when he talks about bread is these miracles that are occurring that bring people food. But deeper than that, when he talks about bread, I think he's talking about these messianic blessings that only Jesus brings to Israel. These are blessings which partly are what the Canaanite woman wants, are blessings of healing, blessings of exorcism, feeding people with bread, and the message of the good news of which the Gentile woman wants to receive. But here's the most offensive part, I think, of this comment, and I'm sure we would all be offended if this was said about us, is that Jesus says then at the end that he has come to give children their bread, but also not to throw it to dogs. Now, you might think this is a derogatory term, and I think that there are some ways that you could read it that way. But I don't read what Jesus says here as derogatory, but rather he's using common language in his parable that his listeners might connect with and better understand. Because this terminology of dogs is really understood in the ancient world of how Jews would speak to Gentiles about. But in Jesus' usage of this word even, he actually uses it in a much softer way. Where for Jewish people, when they talk about dogs, they think of those who are Gentiles as mongrels. People, they're basically feral dogs that live on the streets and they eat corpses and dead things. Instead here, the image is more like, no, you guys are more like pets in the house, small little dogs that live here. But at the same time, he makes very clear that here, the food does not belong to the house pets. They belong to the children. Now, I think as Christians, I think most of us would stop here. We probably would just give up quickly, right? That basically that we would look at what God has said and we would stop here, and then some of us, I think, or many of us might just be angry. We'd say, that's just unfair, and that you haven't met my expectations. You're the one who's in the wrong. How could you do this? How could you say you're loving? And this is something that we hear all the time, I think, when Christians don't get what they have prayed for. And I think certainly we can sympathize, right? I think people are hurting and they have these pains that they have no outlet for, and they direct their anger towards God because it's the only place that they can direct it towards that they feel is going anywhere. But I would say that that's maybe the wrong way of how we should approach as we look about these questions. Our anger oftentimes is pointed in the wrong way. Now, I think it's normal to be angry, and I think it's normal to be frustrated. But I think at the same time, we're pointing our anger at the wrong person. Because it's not God who is causing our death. He's not the one who's causing our pain and suffering in this context. Usually, it's oftentimes, almost always, Satan who is the one who's causing these issues. And it's Jesus or God who is the one who is actually bringing good things that come through them. We actually see this all throughout the Bible. We see this in the story of Joseph, whose brothers sell him into slavery, and God makes something amazing happen, even though what they did was terribly, terribly wrong. You might see it in your own life, where maybe something terribly wrong has happened, but God even uses that for something greater. And this is the way in which God acts. It's oftentimes not God who is the one who's causing these things to occur, but rather he's making sometimes and oftentimes something good that comes out of them. But even if we were to say God is in control and that we could hold some blame over for him, I still don't think this works. I want you to consider if God were like a master painter. And if he were a master painter, I think it would be wrong that we would criticize an unfinished painting and say, this is a terrible piece of painting, this is a terrible piece of work, and yet he's only made a couple brush strokes on the canvas. Because as the person who's critiquing the work, you have no idea where the painter is painting, what he has in mind. You have no idea what he's going to draw. You have no idea what it's going to be. But what you do is, if this person is a master painter and you're watching it, you're actually trusting by faith the quality of work they're about to produce. And that you know that it's going to be great even though you can't see what the final painting is going to be yet. This is the way in which we should see how God works in the world, how we trust him. That though we don't see all the brush strokes, though we don't see the final image of what is happening, God is going to do something great through the picture that he is putting together. That we can expect it to be quality work. And all of his actions will be for his greatness and for our good. Now, I've met many Christians in my life who've shared testimonies. And in their testimony, somehow they feel like they're justified in saying, like, God, you've wronged me, you've done these wrongs, and somehow, God, you've rectified them. That's the only reason why we're okay. But this is never the way in which the scriptures look at this kind of blame. Because it's God who is the one who is redeeming these situations, the one who is resolving them. And it's oftentimes that we are the ones who have sinned, and sometimes the cause of these problems happening. Now, I tell you this story, and I talk about this because there is a right way in which we can approach these difficult conversations with God as we contend with him in prayer. And I think it's best demonstrated in the way that this woman approaches Jesus. When the Gentile woman responds to Jesus and contends with him, she doesn't take offense by what he has said. She doesn't challenge Jesus' fairness or goodness of his plan. Neither does she contend that Jesus' mission is ridiculous. Rather, she accepts that this is the mission, and she requests his help because his help doesn't affect his primary goal to the children of Israel. She takes his primary mission on faith, and yet she strives and contends with God for her request. By working out through the parable's language, her request sounds like this: yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Now, this interaction that Jesus has with this woman may seem accidental, but I don't think it's accidental. I think here, Jesus is not just allowing her, just relenting as she's kind of pushing back against him. I think the goal is that this is a predestined account of God to draw out this woman's heart and to draw out her faith. And ultimately, here, Jesus rewards her heart, her faith, as she says in verse 29 to 30. And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. This story is a story about what a pleasing faith looks like. And that even a Gentile can exert or have a pleasing faith. If you remember last week, we talked about that it's not the external things that make somebody unclean. And so as we look at this woman, it's not because she comes from Tyre or that she's a Gentile anymore that makes her unclean. So that is now removed from the picture. She's not far off because of where she comes from. She's not unclean because of who she is. But rather, as we kind of look at this image, it actually reminds us kind of the story of Jacob. As we read this morning in Genesis chapter 32 to 24 to 28, we read this morning that Jacob is one of the major characters in the book of Genesis, whose name is changed from Jacob to Israel, and he was a person who the rest of Israel descended from because he contended with God and struggled with him and overcame. We see something similar here in the Gentile woman, that she too contends with Jesus and overcomes, and her faith seems genuine to please the Lord. She's also given a very unique identity here in Mark. She's actually the first one in this book to actually understand the parables of Jesus, and where Jesus himself says that only someone who God has been working in can understand these deep things. She's also the only person so far that fully understands what's happening, or at least better understands what's happening. She understands better than the disciples, who seem to still be quite clueless about who Jesus is and what his mission is. She seems quite ahead of those people who've received the actual blessings of the Messiah and still have no idea of who he is. And even from last week, as we saw these Pharisees and scribes in chapter 7, they still struggled with what defiles a person, and yet she understood what a pleasing faith looked like. We see a woman here whose faith is pleasing towards God. And it was pleasing because it understood the deeper identity of who Jesus was and trusted in him, even though against all the things that might look foolish to the people around her, she trusted in him to heal her daughter. Now I want to go back to maybe one of the questions I asked earlier, but I'm going to add a slight twist to it. When you were in need, what is revealed in your own heart and faith? Earlier we talked about this idea that desperation and neediness brings out the nature of our faith and heart because it forces us to see what we truly trust in and what our real hope actually is. So when you are desperate for God to answer and are needed for him to respond, what is it that you find at the bottom of your heart? What is the thing or person that you truly believe and will answer your prayers and can solve the issue that you have in hand, because you're unable to solve it with your own power or to find the solving in the world? What is your prayer time and faith like in the circumstances when you really need God to answer, when you need and are desperate for him to speak or to do or to act? Now, some people say, I don't have time for prayer. I'm too busy for that. Even if I'm desperate, I'm too busy. Now, maybe that might be true sometimes. Maybe you are truly busy, but far more often, the problem with us in our need in turning to God is actually our own heart. As one person said, that our hearts can be prideful and thinks that we can deal with issues on our own. That our hearts can be filled maybe with unbelief, and we keep telling ourselves that prayer doesn't do anything, you're wasting your time. Your hearts also may be telling you that your wealth is a better security than Jesus Christ. Or maybe your heart is telling you that the world isn't really that bad, that Satan really isn't all that bad of a person, that you could trust him rather than Christ. To me, these are the four reasons for myself that I think the large majority of the time we aren't desperate and why we aren't fully engaged in our prayer life in terms of coming towards God. Because if we truly believed that God was at work in our prayers and they were truly effective, our prayer meetings would constantly be overflowing with people. I want to share with you one of the casual conversations I had with one of our elders, Albert, over the last couple of weeks. And again, Albert is one of the people that I hope you're desperately praying for, but there was a brief interaction I had with him here maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. And we just had briefly talked, I don't even know how it came up, but we just briefly talked about what are some things that we're hoping to see. And somehow we both had arrived at the same idea that what we all actually need is we need to be better at praying. This was our common conviction between me and Albert. Unspoken, we had not talked about it before. We had both just arrived at this conclusion. That if our desire as Chinese Gospel Church is to be a missional church, but really if we want to be any kind of church, that at least God wants us to be. None of it will succeed unless we become a more voraciously praying church. Is this not what James talks about in chapter 4, verse 2, that you do not have because you do not ask? If we really believed in prayer, how much would we come to him right now? How much would we be asking him to help those around us who are in need? That if we look at the mission, that help us in the mission of the church, to help us to grow, not just as people in numbers, but in terms of our own personal lives. If we really believed in prayer, wouldn't we be always praying? Wouldn't we be coming up on a Sunday morning when prayer is offered as a group, as corporately, that we would just come up and pray? There's a serious question that we have to ask ourselves, maybe it's just me, about why we don't pray as we should. Again, I want to make clear that as we talk about this topic, I'm not talking just about you. The sermon really was for me this morning. If you know me really well, I'm really sad to say I'm a really critical person. And if you are kind of a critical person like me, you know that the common issue that we have is that we complain too much and praise too little. And there was a moment like maybe months ago where I was just tired of my own complaining. It's, I don't know if you have ever gotten there where you basically are just talking to yourself, you're complaining, and you get sick of yourself. Right? You're just like, oh man, this is like I'm so needy that I disgust myself and my own neediness, my own desperation. And that's where I got to. I got to this point where I was just sick of complaining. I was sick of just spending time thinking that things were not optimal or best, that things were not as good as they were. And what I came to realize in that moment was that I need to spend far more time praying and contending with God to bring about amazing work. That my sentiment became, I need to complain less and pray more. This is the goal that I've had for myself for the last 2 years, that I don't want to just keep complaining and just saying things are not good. I want to get down on my knees and ask the Lord to bring about this amazing work that He tells me that He's working in us already. Make it more evident, make it more clear, make it more powerful, make it more wonderful so that He could be glorified. And that's one thing I hope that we all can join in, that we would all learn to complain less and pray more. I hope at the end of this that you've realized that a dependent faith is a faith that is pleasing to God is not easy. Right? You could tell your kids, hey, your goal as children, if you really want to have faith, is just depend on God. And sometimes it seems like children get this way better than we do, right? I tell my kid to depend on God, and she talks about God all the time. She goes to the park and tells people about Jesus. She goes on a walk and sings songs about Jesus. I am embarrassed because she is a better Christian in some ways than I am, because she depends on Jesus way more than I do. It's funny because it's easy for children but hard for adults. Because for us, as we get older, this kind of faith requires real work, real hard work, because we need to get deeper and deeper in placing our faith in Jesus. But this is the only kind of faith that actually pleases the Lord, one that looks to Him, that grounds their faith, grounds all their hopes upon Him. Because fundamentally, being a Christian means that you trust in God for everything. Every area of life is now open to God. And you are depending upon Him to act and change circumstances that we are in. And this God and our God invites us to contend strongly for the things that He has placed in our heart and in our way. And we can do so through prayer and petition, because our great Father hears and will reward our trust in Him by working things out for His good purposes and bringing glory to His name. So my friends, put all of your dependence on Jesus Christ. Look to Him in prayer, because this is a pleasing faith to God. Let's pray.